Happy holidays, everyone, and depending on how long it takes me to edit this video, perhaps a happy new year too. About 1 year ago, we kicked off a series of open source hardware projects to help tackle some of the ongoing issues associated with the pandemic. Now, it has been one of the craziest years I've ever experienced, and I haven't had a ton of opportunity to update you all. So today, on the day with the least amount of sunshine, at least here in the northern latitude, we're going to do just that. But first and foremost, I want to give a big heartfelt thanks to the team at OpenAeros and Entropic Engineering for all their work in helping generate these ideas and bring them to fruition. It's been an awesome journey. I want to thank their families for letting them come home probably a little bit more tired than normal. And I also want to give a big thanks to my family for letting me be a little bit selfish and focus so much energy on this the last few months. It means a lot to me, and it means a lot to be able to do something that I think really makes a difference. So with all that said, where are we at? Well, let me introduce you to my little friend here, Open CPC. Open CPC is the world's first open source condensation particle counter. We call them CPCs for short. And what is a CPC? Well, a CPC is a particle counter that allows us to measure in real time the concentration of particles from a few micron, those would be about 1/50th of a human hair, down to particles that are incredibly small as 10 nanometers. Why does that matter? Well, first we have to talk a little bit about the air that's all around us right now. In the room that I'm sitting in, there are about 3 to 400 particles per cubic centimeter. How big is a cubic centimeter? It's about the size of a sugar cube, what I have in my hand right here. And that amount of air, the amount of sugar cubes we breathe in every breath is about 500. That's right, we breathe in about 500 of these in every breath. Actually, it's a little known fact that you breathe in more air than anything else that you ingest. Each day you consume about 18 kilograms of air, whereas you might only eat or drink, well, it is the holidays, maybe a bit more, but let's say 1 to 1.2 kilograms of food and 1 kilogram of water. So you consume a lot more air than anything else. So every breath that I'm taking in this space right now, I breathe in 500 of these, and I breathe in about 250,000 particles. If I was near a combustion source like a vehicle or stuck on the freeway, I could breathe in as many as tens of millions of particles in each breath. This is why clean indoor air matters, whether it's in the context of airborne respiratory diseases like COVID, flu, and RSV, or in the terms of exposure to pollution. Now you might say, well, big whoop, Aaron. I can go buy low-cost PM2.5 sensors like the Sensorion SPS30 for under $50. They work great. They can measure really small particles too. Well, actually, I took this sensor here and measured the space that we're in right now. I got about 0.5 micrograms per meter cube of PM2.5 in this space. It's about 1/10 the World Health Organization's new levels. And you shouldn't be surprised, the OpenAeros office is pretty clean. But what's interesting is that I only measured about 4 particles per centimeter cubed, or about 4 particles each sugar cube, whereas the CPC is measuring currently around 200 to 300 particles. That's 100 times more. Why are we seeing so many more particles here? And that's because about how small it can measure. This device can measure particles that are much, much smaller, all the way down to 10 nanometers. And the reason for the different counts is because in most indoor spaces, there's a very large number of particles that are very, very small. We call these ultrafine particles, and by number are the most common particle in the air we breathe, and are mostly visible to low-cost optical sensors like these PM2.5 sensors. So how do we measure it? Well, let me introduce you to the concept of condensation growth. And if you're from a northern latitude climate like myself, you're very familiar with this. If you come from warm, sunny, beautiful California, well, you're probably not as familiar with it, but still probably are. If you go outside on a cold day and breathe out, you can see your breath. Why is that? Well, when you breathe out, water vapor that you breathe out when it's warm and humid hits this cold air. The water vapor begins to condense out, and it condenses out on tiny particles that are in your breath, causing them to grow very, very large with this condensed water. And there is a lot of them, and so it looks like you're breathing out steam or smoke. It's actually the same mechanism that happens when we make clouds as well. So all of this is the same thing. In our device, we do the same thing, but instead of using water, we use isopropyl alcohol, sometimes called rubbing alcohol. And what we do is we have 2 tubes in series. We have a first tube called a saturator, where we pull air in and we expose it to warm, wet walls, in this case wetted with isopropyl alcohol, where the vapor goes into the airstream. We then pass this warm and humid airstream, although it's not really humid, it has isopropyl alcohol, and introduce it into a cold, chilled section we call the condenser. There, because it's cold, the vapor begins to condense out, and it condenses out onto particles that are in the air, and they grow them from maybe 10 nanometers to a few micron. To give you a size context, if a 10 nanometer particle was roughly the size of a grain of rice, we would grow that particle to be about the size of a beach ball. Why? It's much easier to count beach balls than it is grains of rice. What this lets us do is take much of the technology about particle counting that the low-cost sensors have developed over the years and apply them to much smaller particle sizes, and that's kind of the magic with what's in the CPC. Now you might ask yourself, are you the first to invent this? And of course, no. In fact, the first devices that use this mechanism date back to the late 1800s. The Atkin particle counter was a small device. You could pump it down, do the same mechanism, and then you would count them with your eye. Now, these devices have been improved since then, and in the 1970s and 80s, continuous flow versions like what we have here were invented. In fact, around 1981, a couple researchers from the University of Cincinnati had a great idea of trying to hook one up to a respirator to see what happened. What they discovered is that taking advantage of all these tiny particles that are already present in the space, they could measure how well the respirator fitted by measuring the reduction of particles that could be measured inside the mask via this mask port. Taking advantage of all these ultrafines, they discovered that they could actually measure how well a mask was fitting on a person's face and how effective it was. And as you can see on the display here, you can see the reduction of the counts, and they should be dropping down to about 3 to 5 particles per cc, which represents roughly a 99% removal rate by this mask. If you wanted more evidence that masks work, and that they can filter very tiny particles even smaller than a virus, you just witnessed it right here. If I were to be quiet for a while, you would also see it get down even further. So why does this all matter, and why open source? Well, there's a couple reasons why. One, a mask demo here gives a perfect example of one application of the Open CPC, but it also has a lot of other applications, especially in the context of a clean indoor air revolution. For the aerosol science industry, the CPC is very much like its tape measure. It's the fundamental measurement tool, and it can be paired with a wide variety of devices to different and interesting measurements. And just like with the mass test I showed you, where we can measure change in concentration, we can also do that in other things. You could in fact use this to measure how effective a portable air cleaner is. Or you could also use these ultrafine particles without having to do a test aerosol and measure what happens when you add one to a space, and you can measure the effective air changes per hour. So there's a lot of things that the CPC can do, and all of it comes down to using and measuring ultrafine particles. Now, there's another important thing about ultrafine particles, and that they become very interesting in the last decade about their human health effects. There is some evidence that these small particles, when we breathe them in, can go straight from our lungs into our bloodstream. And with a lot of exposure to it, there's not well studied exactly how much they're impacting human health, but there's a lot of concern about them. And they have not been typically studied or regulated because the devices needed to measure them have been historically very expensive. And we hope to solve that now with a low-cost device. So we hope in the ultrafine space we can help as well. So let's get to all the questions you've been waiting to ask. When can I buy one, Aaron? And while we very much want these out into the world as fast as we can, we still have more work to do. We have some work to make sure that they can work in a variety of environmental conditions, from very, very cold to very, very hot. We need to make sure that they can withstand the jumps and bumps and drops that will happen as people use them. And we also have some improvements in our manufacturing process that we need to do to make it much easier to build. So if you want to if you would like to keep updates about what's happening on this project, I've included a link below to the OpenAeros website where we have an email list and you can sign up for all the latest. Of course, you can subscribe to this channel, and then every time we post a video, you'll get it as well. We hope to release this very soon into the open source world via GitLab, and there will be a link for that as well on the OpenAeros website. However, I just want to make one thing really clear. It's unlikely that you'll build one of these yourself because all of the extra stuff you need to assemble it probably doesn't make sense to build one, but the beauty of open source will be that people can service and repair them. And if we do a really good job, this project will outlive us and this company, perhaps, far into the future. And we hope that that becomes kind of our ethos, is that this lives far beyond this. So thanks for hanging around. A happy new year to everybody. And watch for another video that we have soon about respirators. That one actually is going to be super interesting. So hopefully you'll catch that one. But as always, thanks a ton, and I'll see you on the next video.